At long last, let's talk about solar flares, because they aren't what most people think they are. Chances are you've never seen one through a telescope, and it's highly unlikely you'll see one during any solar eclipse. There, now that you've got the punchline of the video, let me defend my statements. Quick note before I do though, next week's video will be about the corona, and after that, I'm going to have to pause this series on solar eclipse features for a few weeks so I can focus on the eclipse photography series. Make sure you subscribe and allow notifications so you can learn how to capture your own images of the total solar eclipse on April 8th. All right, let's get back to flares. A flare is not a feature on the sun. It's an event. When the magnetic field lines near the sun's surface get tangled or otherwise break, they release a huge amount of energy. The released energy takes the form of an intense flash of light. That flash is the solar flare. Flares usually don't happen alone, though. Last week, we talked about how prominences are places where plasma is flowing along magnetic field lines. Well, when those lines break, plasma often gets thrown out as well. So you have two things happening at the same time: the flash of light, which is the flare, and the material that gets released. Now, if that plasma falls back down to the sun, then the event's known as an eruption. However, if the material escapes out into space, astronomers refer to that as an ejection. And hopefully, we'll be able to come back to those terms in a future video. Solar flares actually happen pretty frequently, but most are really small. And that's one reason you haven't seen one. Another factor is that the light from a flare is really high energy, even if the flare itself is really small. The high energy results in most of the light from the flare being given off in X-rays instead of visible light. So that's a second reason why you probably haven't seen one. A flare would have to be huge for you to see any hint of it with a solar filter on a regular telescope. They're much easier to see through a solar telescope, but you still have to be watching at just the right moment. I've done several animations that have captured minor solar flares, but even I've never seen a big flare through my telescope. And that's the last reason for why you've probably never seen a solar flare, is that they're short-lived. Remember, these are events, not features. The smallest flares might only last a few seconds, while the largest flares, they can crackle for up to 20 or 30 minutes in extreme cases. So you really would have to be watching at just the right time. Now it's time to tie all this back to solar eclipses. No flare is going to be bright enough or big enough to be visible to the naked eye. So your only chance of seeing a solar flare is if you're watching during the partial phase of the eclipse with a solar telescope. Yeah, capturing an image of a major flare during totality really would be awesome, but the flare would have to be big, it'd have to be right on the edge of the sun, and it would have to happen in that really narrow 4.5 minute window of totality. Add all of those things up, and the chances of seeing a big flare during the big event on April 8th, it's really vanishingly small. That's okay though, because seeing the corona with your naked eye is going to be plenty spectacular. That's all for this week. Next week, we'll take a look at the corona. Again, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that episode or any of the solar eclipse photography series that's in development. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you again next time here on Totality Town.